Israel, a land of beauty, a land called holy, the land where Jesus Christ was born and lived. But who was the luminous figure who taught in the ancient streets of Jerusalem, touching the lives of so many who felt they were failures? And is it possible that the man who healed beside the Sea of Galilee reaches across the centuries and still changes lives? Even the life of a brilliant musician living rough on the streets of Edinburgh.
They told me that I was going to die. He says, you're 25 and you're putting your life under great danger.
One day Jesus left the Mount of Olives, just behind me there, crossed the Kedron Valley and up to the temple courts. He sat down and pretty soon a crowd gathers around him and he begins to teach. We don't know what he taught that day, but we do know that the class was interrupted. Some religious leaders come to him. Now by now they're getting pretty tired of the young teacher from out of town who's constantly questioning their authority. They'd already tried to get him arrested, and here he is back in the temple courts, teaching the people, their people. And they bring a woman with them. And they say this woman was caught in adultery in the very act. It's almost as if they've dragged her out of a bed somewhere. Where was the man? Wherever is the man. The religious leaders of Jesus' time had tremendous power. It's as if they're saying, we have rules, and those rules were passed down from Moses himself, and by those rules she should be stoned. But what do you say? This was one of the many run-ins Jesus had with the religious establishment. And of course the question was a trap. They'd heard him talk about forgiveness, but how would he square that forgiveness with the demands of the law? The point of it all was to bring down this young teacher. Should we stone her or not?
I was a very happy child, a large family, extended family. We were always doing stuff together, lots of cousins. It was great. I was really musical. I was quite high maintenance as a kid, so it was a great way to focus my energies, and I just had such a passion for it. We had quite a nice house. My mum and dad worked really hard to get there. And one year, I think it was 1995, it was a very, very cold winter. We were away for the Christmas and our house flooded, and we just lost absolutely everything. Everything was destroyed in the flood, and this really had quite a significant effect on my mum, and she got quite sick and she left. We didn't know where she went, and it was a bit confusing. My dad and I were staying in different places to start with. We eventually got a flat, but his job was basically to keep a roof over our heads and food in our stomachs, which he did. I tried to contact my mum, but there was a lot of unanswered questions, and my family wouldn't let on to what was happening really. I didn't know at the time, but she'd asked them not to tell me what had happened. She wasn't well at all, she'd had a breakdown. My family was my one world kind of comfort zone, and it was just in the space of a month or two, it was just completely decimated. And life's incredibly intense when you're 15, and I didn't have anybody to talk to or anybody to turn to really, so it was just a lot of emotions, and I just got incredibly angry.
But Jesus didn't answer their question. Instead, he bent and he began to write with his finger in the sand. I wonder what he wrote that day. It's the only occasion in the Bible we read of Jesus writing, but we don't know what he wrote. But his enemies perhaps thought he was just buying time, and so they pressed him, should we stone her or not? And finally he said, well, do it. Just do it. But let the one who has no sin throw the first stone. Well, silence. And then the Bible says a fascinating thing, that one by one they begin to walk away, beginning with the oldest. But finally even the arrogant young men have gone, and it's just her and him. And he looks up at her and says, "Where are those who condemned you?" And she says, "There are none left, Lord." "Well, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more."
For some reason I just dealt with it all on the inside, isolated myself quite a bit, continued to go out and have a laugh and party. I mean, I was really good at it, you know, and I could charm the face off of anybody as well, so I was into the girls in a big way. And around about that time there was a big sort of dance club scene and underground music scene, so by the time I was 16 I was taking ecstasy and speed and cocaine in the dance clubs. We used to go out at night, party until the wee hours in the morning, go to somebody's house for a couple of hours, and then I'd go into school. I was still doing pretty well at school. I got accepted into the Royal Scottish Academy of Music to study classical guitar, so I was set up for the next 3 or 4 years. First year was just a blur. I was drinking a bottle of vodka before I went out to the nightclubs or the bars or whatever. It was getting pretty hardcore, and by the end of my first year my psychological state was pretty poor, really depressed. Halfway through second year I attempted to take my own life with an overdose. It wasn't really, I don't think I really wanted to do it. It was more for a cry for help. For more the second time when I cut myself, I mean that was a real deal. Things at the uni just went from bad to worse, and they tried to help me out as much as they could. They really did, but I was so lost. I was drinking every day, I was taking drugs whenever I could, and I was just a mess, a right royal mess. And by the time I got to the end of my third year, I had to leave because I didn't meet the necessary steps required in order to progress into my final year. So that was the end of that.
Leprosy was the cruelest of diseases. It began with a small spot on the skin and then gradually developed until sometimes the sufferer was just left with a stump of an arm or a leg. Imagine waiting for your community to decide whether or not you had that illness. On that decision rested whether or not you spent the rest of your life as an outcast, living outside the city walls, leaving home and family, hardly knowing whether you could give them one last hug. The leper was medically and socially unclean. And in fact, it was that very word they had to yell out as they walked along. Unclean, unclean. Knowing people were terrified of even touching, of becoming like him. And one day, Jesus had just finished teaching on the mountain. And he's walking down the road, and suddenly he is face to face with a leper. What would he do? Turn away in embarrassment and fear? I wonder whether their eyes locked for a moment as the leper waited for Jesus' reaction. Only somebody in that man's position could truly understand the magnitude of what happened next. Perhaps it was the first time that man had felt human flesh in 20 years. I sometimes wonder if in the years ahead, as he told the story of what happened on the mountain road that day, he said, "The Master made me well, and he touched me."
Well, I left home and I went to live in Thailand. I got an English qualification where I could teach English as a foreign language. That lasted for about 3 months, and I literally just locked myself away and nearly drank myself to death on Thai whiskey, which isn't really whiskey, it's more like formaldehyde. And I lost 30 kilos in weight, hospitalised twice. My mum had to come and get me because I was just mad, just completely off the wall. Had a nervous breakdown on the flight going back because she wouldn't let me drink. And when I got home, I was admitted into psychiatric hospital because I was just psychologically a mess.
You were banned from the hostels. Why was that?
I was a very aggressive guy with a skin full of booze. I'd fight everybody. I'd fight my friends, even people that were kind enough to give me somewhere to stay. So, quite rightly, I was kicked out. I sold all my stuff, pawned a £2,000 guitar for £100 and bought drugs with it, which was just a common occurrence, you know. I started begging when I ran out of money, stealing and doing things for money I never imagined ever having to do. It's amazing what you'll do when you're desperate, you know.
Simon was a religious leader, and he decided to throw a party for some of his friends and some of the religious establishment's A-list. And he also decided to invite the young teacher that everybody was talking about. But it was one thing to invite Jesus and quite another for his friends to think he approved of him. So he devised a little plan that distanced himself from Jesus and also had the chance to ridicule him a little. He thought that might go down well with some of the other guests. When every guest came to a party like that, the first thing that would happen is the servant would bend and wash their feet. A mixture of dust, dirt, and donkeys and sandals made that a good idea for everybody's sake. And then as they went into the room, the host would anoint them with oil and give them a kiss. It was a sign of blessing. It said, "You're welcome in my home." But the servant was told, when he comes in, the teacher, leave his feet dirty, and I won't kiss him, and we won't anoint his head with oil. And Jesus is the only one in the party, unkissed, unanointed, and with dirty feet. People ate either reclining, as you've seen the Romans do, or kneeling, but either way, those dirty feet of Jesus were showing. Around those rooms was often a narrow stone shelf, and people from the village were allowed to come in and stand near the shelf, as long as they didn't interfere with the party. And a woman comes in. She's almost certainly been a prostitute, and a previous encounter with Christ has changed her life. And as she watches these indignities poured on the one who has done so much for her, she starts to cry. And the tears hit the dirty feet of Jesus. And then she does something no woman of repute should have ever done in public. She takes the clip out of her hair, she lets it go long, and she begins to dry the tears with her hair. And then perhaps it was a tool of her trade. She had some perfume with her, and she smashed the bottle and poured it all over Jesus' feet. She begins kissing his feet. And Simon the Pharisee looks and thinks, now I know he's nobody. If he was, he wouldn't let her touch him. He's no prophet. But Jesus is reading Simon's heart. And he says, Simon, I'd like to tell you a story. And Simon made the dreadful mistake of saying, well, tell on. And Jesus said there were two men, and they both owed money to the same man. One owed £100 and one owed £10,000. And neither could repay the debt. So the man forgave them both. Now, Simon, which of them would love him most? Well, Simon was no fool. Well, the one who was forgiven most. Right answer, said Jesus. You know, Simon, when I came into your party tonight, you didn't wash my feet. You didn't anoint my head with oil. You didn't even kiss me. But this woman has washed my feet with her tears. She's dried them with her hair. She's kissing my feet. She's anointed my feet with expensive perfume. And you know what, Simon? Those who've been forgiven much love much. And then Jesus turned to the woman and he said words that brought the roof down on that party. Later on, the other guests said, what right did he have to say those words? But perhaps he said them so she never felt that crushing guilt again. Not when she passed that old familiar street corner, not when she bumped into previous clients in the marketplace, or even in this very party. She never forgot the words he spoke that night in front of everybody. You are forgiven.
I became homeless so I could feed my habit in peace. I thought at first I was going to be warmer sitting in stair closes or something like that, but these are just big bits of stone that are frozen, so you're inside a freezer basically, you know what I mean? So it was actually warmer outside than it was inside, you know. It wasn't so much about staying warm, it was about staying dry, because if you got wet, you're headed for A&E. And the irony is, I could have went home to my mum or dad's on the condition that I was sober, but I was just so angry with them for the things that had happened in my life that I'd rather I'd been out in the cold, really messed up in one way or another, than having to go home and face it.
What was your lowest point?
When I was letting people abuse me for money. I was just absolutely desperate. And you'll do anything when you're desperate. Self-harmed quite a lot. I've got scars all over my body. And throwing up bile every morning. It was just uncontrollable withdrawals, which just forced you to go begging again. And you're desperately frantic as an addict in withdrawal, you know, you desperately need a fix. So you literally will do anything.
In the eye of the storm, surrounded by flames, I fall to pray, I fall to pray. With my hands to the sky, I call your name. Come Yahweh, come Yahweh. With the sound of the thunder, like a war cry of wonder, and I hold on for you. And the flash of the lightning, so fearsome and frightening, I hold on for you. So come on and rain down on me. Come on and rain your love down on me. When the whisper falls and the shadow turns, when the coldest heart begins to burn, rain your love down on me. Have mercy on me. Have mercy on me. Have mercy on me.
Jesus and his disciples had just crossed to this side of the lake, and as they do, a man comes up to him. His name is Jairus. He's a leader in a local synagogue. And his only daughter, she's just 12 years old, is ill. And he falls at Jesus' feet and he says, please come to my home. My little girl is sick. And Jesus, the disciples, the crowd are all moving towards Jairus' home. In that crowd is a woman. The Bible says she's been bleeding for 12 years. But her illness didn't just have medical implications, but social ones. The law said she was unclean. If she touched you, you had to go home and wash from head to foot. She should have never been out in public. But she hears that Jesus is coming to her town. She sees in him not only her last hope, but her only hope. But she can't get near him because of the crowd. On the edge of every Jewish man's clothes were tassels, And as Jesus is walking along, these tassels are swinging. And she manages to reach out and just touch the edge of one of these. As she does, it's as if the film freezes. And Jesus says, "Who touched me?" The disciples say, "Everybody is pressing against you. Everybody is touching you." "No, somebody touched me." And suddenly she comes out of the crowd, and in fear and trembling she says, "It was me." And Jesus does a lovely thing. You know, this woman's self-esteem was through the floor. Compassion is oozing out of him. He says, "Daughter, daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Shalom." But of course now they've been delayed, and Jairus' servant comes and says, "Don't trouble the master anymore. Your little girl is dead." I wonder what went through Jairus' mind. Perhaps he thought, you know what, this woman has been ill for 12 years. He could have waited a few hours and dealt with her later on, but my little girl's gone now. And Jesus looks at Jairus right in the eye and says, "Don't be afraid, just believe."
What was the turning point?
Well, I knew I was going to change her, I was going to die. And I looked for help. I went to AA meetings, but people sitting talking about drink made me want to go and drink, you know. And I needed some intensive rehabilitation. And I came across the Bethany Christian Centre, which is a homeless charity in Scotland, the Bethany Christian Trust. And they had a hostel for homeless men who wanted to make changes in their life, and they do a recovery program, but it's biblically based, all Jesus and Bible. And I'll be honest with you, I never really had much time for that, but I needed the recovery aspect. So on the 13th of February 2006 they gave me a bed.
What were those ensuing weeks and months like?
It was very, very difficult. I didn't have any contact with friends or family at that point, so it was tough. It was really tough. They would also invite you to the occasional Christian event, you know, because that's what Christians do. And I would politely decline on every occasion. But one night it said evening of testimony, and it was in a posh hotel, and it said free 5-course dinner. So I was going, and I'd never had a 5-course dinner before. I was naturally curious. I'd be a bit disappointed that the 5th course was a cup of coffee. But it was great. We went along, we had our dinner, and then a man stood up and started to share his testimony, church minister. I'd never heard a testimony before, and I thought, this guy's going to tell me all this stuff again, that I need what he's got and he's got what I need and blah blah blah. But I was actually quite shocked at what he started to talk about, because when he was a younger guy he'd actually been quite a bad lad, and he'd spent time in prison. He was a gangster, violent man, did time for attempted murder, and heavily involved with drugs. He was a thief, a liar, and I could relate to a lot of what this guy had to say. When he spoke about his faith and becoming a Christian, it didn't feel weird, and it didn't make me cringe. I was actually really interested in what he had to say.
When Jesus went into Jairus' house, he had with him just Peter, James and John and the little girl's parents. And Jesus walked to the bed where the little girl was lying. And he took her by the hand and he said, "Talitha cumi," little girl, I say to you, get up. And then he turned to the girl's parents. Get her something to eat.
Then he said something I'll never forget. He said there was freedom in Christ. And that really got my attention, because I was a prisoner. There wasn't any walls in my prison. But if you speak to any prisoner, any real prisoner, about the prospect of freedom, you're going to get their undivided attention. And I'd tried everything I possibly could. So I went forward and I prayed, and it was nothing beautiful or grammatically eloquent. I just said, God, if you can hear me, I just want a life worth living. And I felt the presence of God wash over me. I felt the Spirit of God come into my life. And I'm quite a sceptical guy. I'm a sceptical Christian. I question everything, you know. But I felt peace just wash over me, and I'd never known any kind of peace as an adult. I'd been in fear my whole life. Fear of fitting in, fear of acceptance, fear of getting my next fix, or I was just afraid constantly. And when I felt that peace, all the fear and the shame and the anger, I mean, I couldn't look myself in the face without spitting at it in the mirror or punching it. Self-harming, I was so ashamed of the stuff that I'd done to other people, and just relentless fury. I never even knew what I was angry for. It just felt like somebody said, you don't need to deal with that anymore, and lifted it from my shoulders. And I never felt so free in my life.
When I found Jesus, He was holding on to me. I was broken, I couldn't stand on my own 2 feet. Said a word and broke my chains, and I was free to breathe again. My life was saved by the love and blood of Jesus. When I found Jesus, He was standing over me. I was down and out, and I was living on the streets. There were times I could have died, but the Lord was by my side. And I didn't know it then, but I've been saved by the blood of Jesus. The empty promises of the world had forsaken me. Left me in a wilderness. It was Jesus who rescued me. He called my name, and I would never be the same, no. Just one touch from the King of Kings, it changes everything. He changes everything. Oh, when I found Jesus, He was heavy on my heart. I was lost for words, I didn't know where to start. All I know is I believe more than that I did receive, 'cause my sins were paid by the love and blood of Jesus. He took the weight off my shoulders. Troubles, and Lord, I have been blessed. Oh my Lord, I have been blessed.
The Sea of Galilee is a beautiful place. 13 miles long, 8 miles wide. And although in the mornings it can often be very calm, the afternoons can be quite different. Sometimes the prevailing winds sweep down the valleys, and Galilee can become a raging storm in moments. This lovely stretch of water can be a dangerous place. And it was on this water that some of the disciples, Peter, James and John, earned their living as fishermen before that day when they met the man who said, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." One day, the disciples took Jesus to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, the quieter side. And as they set off, all was well. But by the time they got to the middle of the sea, a storm was raging. Some of those disciples were fishermen, and they became afraid. They knew how dangerous that sea could be. But as the storm raged, Jesus was asleep in the back of the boat. And the disciples did their best to keep the little boat afloat, but eventually they were at their wits' end. They woke him and said, "Don't you care? Don't you care that we're going to drown?" They never forgot what happened next. He stood in the boat in the storm, and he told the wind to stop and the waves to get down, as if he was talking to a puppy jumping up at a table. And immediately the wind stopped and there was a great calm. But now the disciples have another problem. A moment ago they were afraid of the storm, but now they are terrified of the man in the boat with them. And they say, "Who is this, that even the wind and the waves obey him?"
And the guy I heard preaching that night, he said, "Do you really think your life would be easy if you weren't an addict?" You know, he said, "Life's hard, but you can rise to the challenge." He told me I should be on my knees praying every night, asking for strength and guidance. And so I did, in my wee room in the homeless hostel, and I did find strength, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you've been a slave to addiction for 10 years, a bit of strength is a miracle, you know. Instead of reaching for a bottle, I was reaching for the Bible. And when I did the groups and they spoke about Jesus and the things that he did and the things that he shared, it really meant something to me. I mean, deeply. I can't deny the things that have happened. And all I know is that when I was at a point where I reached out and asked God to come into my life, something changed. And I can't deny that. And he's always been there. He's never let me down. He's always got me through, especially the tough stuff.
The night before Jesus died, he met with his disciples to eat the traditional Passover meal. The Bible says they met in an upper room. But the friends of Jesus had no idea when they entered that room of the long and traumatic night that lay ahead. Within the early hours of the following morning, Jesus would be arrested. Within 24 hours, he'd be dead and buried. And it was during that meal that he told his disciples three things that rocked their world. Firstly, he said, "One of you is going to betray me." Secondly, "One of you will deny me." Peter protested, "Everybody else may deny you, but I never will." And thirdly, and worst of all, he said, "I'm going to leave you now." They'd left everything to follow him, friends, family, businesses, jobs, and now he was leaving them. Peter said, "Where are you going that I can't come?" And Jesus said, "In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you." And Thomas said, but we don't know where you're going, and we don't know the way. And Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." By the time the meal finished, it was already getting late. When the meal was over, Jesus and his disciples left the upper room, walked through the streets of Jerusalem, out of the city gate, and then came down the side of the Kedron Valley and eventually began climbing the hill on the other side towards an olive grove where Jesus often met with his disciples. When Jesus and his disciples reached the garden, he looked for a place where he could pray. He said to Peter, James, and John, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow. Come with me while I pray. And he went on from them a little way, and he fell to his knees. He was filled with anguish. He knew that the cross was imminent. And he prayed, Father, if it's possible, let this cup of suffering pass from me. And then he said, nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. When he came back to the disciples, they were fast asleep. He said, couldn't you watch with me for 1 hour? And then he looked down the hill and he saw the torches that the soldiers were carrying that were coming up to the garden to arrest him. And he said, my betrayer is at hand. And he was right, because Judas was with them. And Judas had given them a secret sign so they would know who to arrest. And he comes to Jesus and he kisses him. A kiss. And Jesus says, Judas, do you betray me with a kiss? And then the soldiers come to take him, and Peter, filled with rage and frustration, lashes out with his sword, and he takes the ear off one of the men. And Jesus says, Peter, put away your sword. And he reaches out and he heals the man. And he says, do you come for me with swords and clubs as though I were leading a rebellion? Every day I was with you in the temple courts and you didn't lay a hand on me. But this is your moment when darkness reigns. And then suddenly all the disciples ran, just left him finally alone. That long Good Friday had begun. And it was on this spot where occurred the lowest moment of Peter's life. You know, he was very impetuous, and before that instant occurred, he'd said to Jesus, you know, I would lay down my life for you. And Jesus said, Peter, would you lay down your life for me? Before the cock crows, you'll deny 3 times you even know me. And a little while after that, Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, brought down the Kedron Valley, and up these steps to the house of the high priest. His interrogation was about to begin. But it was far worse than an interrogation. Over there they were beating Jesus, they'd hooded him. Somebody slapped him on the face and said, if you're such a great prophet, you should be able to see through the blindfold. Which of us hit you? And of course it was about to get far worse than that. Within hours he'd be whipped within an inch of his life, and later that day he'd be crucified. And the guards had lit a fire in the courtyard of the house, and Peter was warming himself by the fire. And there was a young girl there. She was a servant of the high priest, and she'd been staring at Peter. And she said, you're one of his followers, aren't you? And Peter said, no, I'm not. I don't even know him. And then a little later, somebody else was looking at him and said, yes, you are one of them. No, man, I am not, he said. And then about an hour later, Peter had a real piece of bad luck. When Jesus had been arrested in Gethsemane, Peter had tried to defend the master with his sword and injured one of the soldiers. And now one of that man's relatives spotted him and said, yes, you were with him in the garden. And then Peter lost it. With oaths and curses and swearing, he was saying, I don't even know the man. And as he spoke, the dawn was breaking. And in the distance, Peter heard a cock crowing. Jesus turned and he looked straight at Peter. And suddenly the words of Jesus flashed back through Peter's mind. Before the cock crows, you will deny 3 times you even know me. And Peter left the courtyard and cried bitterly.
In reverence, always bear witness. Never let silence be your confession. Fear not the path you must humbly walk. You carry the truth and hope of salvation. You will speak in my name, heaven's authority in your heart. So come out of the dark and let there be light on the road. Fall on your knees, open your eyes, and the truth will set you free. Oh, and now for my sake, rise and carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and the sons of Israel.
On the Sunday after Jesus died, two of his disciples were making their way home to a little village about 7 miles outside of Jerusalem. It was called Emmaus. The one they had followed had been killed by the Roman authorities, and as they walked, their minds were going back over all the years. They remembered him still in the storm on Galilee, raising a young girl back to life again, healing a desperately sick woman, and bringing fresh hope to so many who seemed to have lost even the will to live. And as they walked, suddenly a stranger joined them. "Why so sad?" the man asked. They said, "Are you the only one in Jerusalem who hasn't heard about these things?" "What things?" asked the stranger. And they blurted it out. "Well, about Jesus of Nazareth. He was a prophet, not just in what he said, but in what he did. And we believed he was the one to redeem Israel, get rid of the Roman occupiers, set us free." And they killed him. And there's more. Some women we know went to the tomb this morning. His body was gone. And some friends of ours went to check it out. It is true. The tomb is empty. The stranger listened to them carefully. He saw a deep sadness not just on their faces, but in their souls. And he began to explain to them from their scriptures things the prophets had written hundreds of years before about a Messiah who one day would come and suffer for the sake of others. The Bible says that as the two disciples talked that day with the stranger on the road to Emmaus, their hearts burned within them. When they eventually reached the village they were heading to, the stranger made as though he would have said goodbye and gone on, but they said, no, it's late. Stay the night with us. And they came in and they sat down to eat a meal together. And they gave him the honor of breaking the bread and blessing it, and the stranger took the bread. And then they watched as he broke it in that old distinctive style that they'd seen him do 100 times before. And suddenly it was as if their eyes were opened. It was him. And then just as suddenly, he was gone. On one occasion, when Jesus appeared to his disciples after he'd risen from the dead, they're back in Galilee. 3 years before, Jesus had called Peter to leave his fishing business, but suddenly Peter said, "I'm going fishing," and the other said, "We'll come with you." Perhaps it was the desire for something familiar, something at least they could understand, but it doesn't go well. And that night they catch nothing. But as the early morning light begins to break, they see a figure on the shore. And the man shouts, "Friends, have you caught any fish?" "No," they answer. "Throw the net on the other side of the boat." Well, what do they have to lose? But as they do, the catch is so great they can hardly drag the net back in. And suddenly John knows who it is. And he says to Peter, it's the Lord. And immediately the disciples are rowing as fast as they can to get the boat to the land, but not Peter, not the impetuous one. No, he dives in, he's swimming as fast as he can to get to the shore.
It wasn't like abracadabra, here's a wife and 3 kids and a shiny guitar. I wouldn't be here, and I know that for a fact. I wouldn't be here if Christ hadn't reached out and found me and told me that I was better, that I was worth more, and that there was a life worth living out there for me. If there was one thing that He truly gave me, it was the courage to face the things in life which were killing me. He's the friend that I never knew that I had, that's always there for me, never lets me down, no matter what happens.
In a light the world had never seen, and He stood over death in victory. He said, now you can live forever with me. He said, now you can live forever with me.
Even if I was to meet my Maker tomorrow, I could honestly stand toe to toe with Him and say, thank you for the 10 years that I truly knew what it was to live.
Jesus, save my soul. When He died for me many years ago, set us free. When He died on the cross, He died for you, for me. And then He rose from shadows in a light the world had never seen, and He stood over death in victory. He said, now you can live forever with me. He said, now you can live forever with me, with me.
And when they got to the shore, breakfast was waiting. Charcoal fire with some fish on it, some bread, and Jesus said, come and eat. But one of them had so much to talk to Him about, so much to sort out. And as they sat by the fire, Jesus said, Peter, do you love me? Peter had asked himself that question 100 times since he'd sat by the fire in the high priest's courtyard one day and denied he'd even known Jesus. But now, as he sat by this fire, by the Sea of Galilee, he knew the answer to that question. Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Of course, when he said that, he had no idea what lay ahead. That in the weeks to come, he'd preach to thousands in the streets of Jerusalem, that the message would spread like wildfire, that eventually he would lay down his life for the one who had died for him. He knew none of that then. But as they spoke, Jesus said 2 words. And the minute he spoke them, Peter knew that he was forgiven, that Jesus still believed in him. They were the same words that Jesus spoke 3 years ago by the Sea of Galilee when he first called Peter and his brother Andrew. Jesus said, "Follow me."